At the midpoint of last year, AMD's RX 5700 and 5700 XT graphics cards appeared on store shelves. These GPUs were solutions aiming to provide gamers a card capable of delivering 1440p visuals at high frame rates. So, it was inevitable that AMD would follow up with a lower spec card targeting gamers who were looking to spend around the $200 mark. And, well, that's just what we have here. The RX 5500 XT has finally launched. AMD claims that this card is capable of dealing with pretty much any AAA title at 1080p at high frame rates. So, let's test that, shall we? A common question I get asked is if the RX 5500 XT is a better purchase than Polaris, particularly given the current cheap pricing of the older series of cards. To this end, we will also be including the RX 480 in our testing, both at stock clock frequency and also running faster than the RX 580 too. This gives you an idea of how well the older silicon will fare in 2020 against its newer, shiny cousin. My name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we'll be reviewing this particular card. This is a Sapphire Pulse Edition card, and it was sent over by AMD for the purposes of review. Now, we don't get to keep this card, it is going back to AMD, but I like to get all disclaimers out of the way at the beginning of the review so you know exactly what has been going on and where we've procured this particular review sample. Before we get into the performance of the card and whether you should plonk your cash down on it, let's take a look at the specifications as well as the aesthetics of the GPU. The design of the Sapphire Pulse RX 5500 XT 4GB is pretty basic, yet looks and feels solid in construction. The front of the card is decked out with two fans, which are largely silent in operation unless you start cranking them above 70-ish% of speed. An aluminium cooler sits underneath the fans, complete with 3 beefy heat pipes. The shroud holding the fans is made out of a comfortingly solid-filling plastic, with little branding present other than the Sapphire and Pulse logos. I've no real problems with this, at least it won't clash with your style of case theme. The rear of the card continues the black theme, with a white Sapphire Pulse logo complete with a tasteful amount of red. The backplate and cooler are larger actually than the PCB they cover, with an 8-pin power connector signifying the end of the board. The rear I/O is also not surprising. 3 display ports and a single HDMI port, exactly what you'd expect from a modern day AMD graphics cards. So the short version of it is the RX 5500 Pulse Edition from Sapphire is pretty much whisper quiet. The cooler is extremely beefy, especially given the TDP of the GPU. In our open air bench, we couldn't really hear it, and it was sitting around the mid-60s in terms of temperature. It's massively quieter and considerably cooler than the RX 5700 reference design, which was actually one of the big complaints we had with the reference design GPU, was the noise levels of it, which is one of the reasons we recommended picking up a AIB custom card. So yes, with this particular GPU, with the Sapphire Pulse RX 5500, unless you start to push the fans up, let's say 70-ish%, you probably won't hear it, and a default fan profile, especially if it's a closed-off case, and even more so if you've got headphones on, you simply won't hear this card. The Nave 14 silicon found in the RX 5500 XT has several significant cuts compared to the Nave 10 silicon, which powers the RX 5700 series. Just 22 compute units versus 36 of the RX 5700. We also see a drastic reduction in memory bandwidth, thanks to half the memory bus width. This is only 128-bit. The memory configuration can either be 4 or 8 GB, though the Sapphire Pulse variant we have is loaded with only 4 GB. Still at the same clock frequency as the RX 5700 series, 14 Gbps, providing just 224 GB per second of bandwidth, given once again it's half the bus width of the RX 5700. The GPU runs at a boost frequency of 1845 MHz, though in games AMD claims a frequency on average of 1717 MHz. Sapphire has stuck to these reference specs of the RX 5500 XT, and the choice of cooler does allow the GPU to crank itself higher during gaming sessions. We'll also touch on overclocking for a moment, and maxing out the memory slider and AMD's overclocking utility, so that's 1860 MHz, aka 14,800 MHz effective, as it works on a ×8 figure, and also nudging around the settings on the core. We applied 20 to 30% additional power limit, and, well, long story short, setting a target of around 2 GHz, we got a stable 1940 to 1970 MHz. You'll see overclocking results during our testing in just a moment, but the spoiler here is that you only get a few additional percent of performance at the most. Given it's so easy to do and the card was stable, you might as well do it, but it's not something that's going to make a huge performance gain. Basically, there's just not that much left in the tank. So, a few notes about our testing methodologies before we get into the performance graphs. We're going to be using an Intel i9-9900K, which was kindly provided by Intel. It is overclocked to 5 GHz across all cores. This keeps consistency with our other benchmarks for various other graphics cards over the last several months, so we can see how well it performs. We're also going to be testing this on a Z390 Gaming Pro Carbon motherboard, which was kindly provided by MSI, and we're running with 16 gigabytes of memory. All games are patched to their latest respective versions, and they are also running on separate SSDs as well, so the OS is on one SSD and games are stored on another. I'm also focusing the majority of our testing at 1080p, because realistically, while this card is capable of 1440p gaming, and we will be including 1440p results, we feel that the majority of people will be purchasing this particular card for the target resolution of 1080p. I've also decided to include the RX 480 as well in this test. This was a card that I bought back at launch, and I've decided to run it with two different configurations. One is stock, so 2000 MHz, which is 8000 effective for the memory, as well as 1266 for the core, and I've also overclocked it, so it's 2150 for the memory, and 1340 if memory serves for the core. So that basically means it's roughly on par with an RX 580 in terms of the clock frequency of the core, albeit with more memory bandwidth, because the RX 580 does not have faster memory compared to the 480. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how well the 5500 XT performs against the RX 480. Okay, so now that we're a few benchmarks in, we can see that the RX 5500 does a pretty decent job of handling 1080p games, but also so does the RX 480. We actually did a retrospective of the RX 480, which was around 3 years old at the time I put the video out last year, so you can check that out. I'll try to remember to link it in the video description. But honestly, given that card cost around the $200 mark when it launched back in 2016, it's still really impressive what that GPU is capable of. Also, some titles are just incredibly demanding, even at 1080p. Metro Exodus is a really good case in point here. At 1080p, with all of the settings cranked up, cards such as even the RTX 2080 are not capable of huge high frame rates. In other words, you would most likely want to turn down the settings even on an RX 5500 XT at 1080p if you're looking for a higher frame rate experience. Very soon, given we've got an RTX 2060 Super, 2070 Super, as well as the 2080 Ti, Zotac and MSI came to the rescue for the 2060 and 2070 cards. We'll be doing a more in-depth analysis on ray tracing performance and also what the best settings are for games and what you can kind of squeeze out of different graphics cards. So if you do want that kind of investigation, do stick around with us because we'll be putting that content out as soon as possible. So in games which are shader bound, the RX 5500 XT does extremely well. But the 4GB memory buffer does seem to impact minimum frame rates here and there. And in games like Resident Evil 2, for example, there are much higher quality texture settings, and we were forced to essentially use 1GB textures, or we would start to notice a lot of hitching during gameplay, even at just 1080p. So this gives you several different choices, and here they are. So the RX 5500 XT, especially the Sapphire card, is really, really nice. And if you are targeting 1080p right now, and perhaps you want to just see how the GPU market evolves over the next year or so, and you are looking to buy an RDNA-based GPU, I have no qualms at all recommending this card. It's really nice. But if you have a little more cash, I would suggest picking up the RX 5500 XT 8GB. I'm much more comfortable recommending an 8GB card in the year 2020, especially given we don't really know what games are going to look like in the next 6 to 12 months in terms of how much texture data they will require, particularly given the next generation consoles is, well, not that long away really. Furthermore, cards like the RX 480 and 580 still have a lot of value. AMD themselves actually consistently email me, because obviously I'm a member of the press, to remind people that, hey, we have Polaris-based GPUs and we're bundling games with them. Despite Polaris having a significantly less efficient shader architecture, which runs at a significantly lower clock speed compared to RDNA, the RX 480 here can hold its own against the RX 5500 thanks to the 36 compute units versus the 22 of RDNA, plus also additional memory bandwidth. So the answer to this question is, if you don't mind picking up an older generation of card, especially for the prices Polaris is currently selling for, it's definitely a great alternative to the RX 5500 XT. This is even more of a factor when you consider that you can buy a custom card with factory overclocks, and this is loaded with 8GB of memory for the same price as you would pay for a 4GB RX 5500 XT. Quite honestly, if you are looking to spend 170-ish on a graphics card, an RX 580, for example, is still a very compelling solution, and honestly at some point you can actually get retailers which will give pretty decent discounts. So don't discount, the RX 580 out either. If you are looking to also go the Nvidia route, there are solutions such as the GTX 1660 Super. Now of course, that would mean that you're not going to go with an AMD solution, and also the 1660 Super is a little more expensive as well, but you do also get additional VRAM. Now, my job as a reviewer is not to just say whether a product is good or bad. As I mentioned a moment ago, the RX 5500 XT is a really nice card, but I also feel it's my duty to give you other options. So yes, the 1660 Super is more expensive, but you also get a little bit more performance out of the tank, and also you get more VRAM as well. However, if you're willing to break the piggy bank and spend around $100 more, then cards such as the RX 5600 XT become available to you, and obviously performance takes quite a leap. But then again, you're spending about $100 more to buy one of these cards. So as always, these are considerations that you need to make based upon your budget. I also realised that there is some stuff going around at the moment regarding people complaining about AMD's drivers. Now, I can only speak to my experiences. I've tested this, as I mentioned, on the i9-9900K, which is an MSI Z390 Gaming Pro Carbon motherboard, and I've also tested it on a BioStar X570 GTA motherboard, although it's largely torn down. You can see it in the background there. I've taken out the memory and other bits and pieces at the moment, and I tested that with 3700X, which is obviously different Windows installs and, you know, drivers and stuff, and I had no problems. I've not had any weirdness. I will say that, well, that's not 100% true. The one thing I did experience was the fan sometimes could take a little bit longer than I'd like to catch up. So in other words, if you start playing around with the fan, sometimes if you crank it, let's say, to 100% and then crank it back down to, let's say, 40%, the fan just takes longer than what you would like to respond. So you can have a really noisy fan on the card for a few moments while you're waiting for it to kind of ramp down, and I find that behaviour really annoying. But other than that, I've not had any crashes or anything like that. But I do know that other people have, and yeah, I can only speak to my personal experiences. The drivers are around as stable as Nvidia's. I found that even when I'm being silly with the clock frequencies and messing around with power limits and overclocking the GPU, the driver did respond. I believe once it didn't, I had to do a reset, but like out of the 10 or so crashes I had because I was messing around with the card and starting to overclock it and just like cranking it all the way up and finding out what the fans would, what the lowest fan speeds and stuff I could run the card at. And this is both with the 5500 and 5700, so I'm combining these experiences just to be clear. I believe there's only once it didn't recover, which is fairly impressive and around what I experienced, I believe, with Nvidia hardware. But once again, I am not saying that people do not experience issues with AMD drivers. I can just say from my personal experience, I didn't have any problems. Anyway, to give my closing thoughts on the RX 5500 XT Sapphire Pulse, I think it's a really nice card. The only qualm I have with it, honestly, is the amount of VRAM. I would consider purchasing a similar card. Sapphires are really nice brands, by the way, from AMD. So I would suggest a similar, but potentially just spending a few more pennies and purchasing a card with 8GB of memory, just so you've got a little bit of additional room for growth. But hopefully you found the review informative. Of course, if you did, then leave a like on the video because it, of course, helps in YouTube land. And also, comment down below if you've had any experiences with the RX 5500 thus far and what you think of the particular GPU. But I'm going to let you all go, so thanks very much for watching the video. Take care of yourselves, and bye for now.